Hello and welcome. My name's Kevin Cranny, and this is the AP United States History review session. Unit 1, A New World. I'm going to try and do a video for every unit in the Tyndall and Shih America, A Narrative History textbook. So this is the video for Unit 1, entitled A New World. So let's begin, shall we? It all starts out with the natives, and there were two major civilizations in the New World at the time the Europeans came, and that was the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. The Spaniards were able to conquer them very easily. They were very underdeveloped compared to the Europeans. On the bottom left is the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. But there was no major civilizations in North America. There were small tribes of hunters and gatherers. On the bottom right, there is the flag of the Iroquois Confederacy. Um, so yeah, let's move on. Hopefully this chart didn't cause you to go blind, but it outlines the European colonizers, and there's three major ones: Spain and France and England. Spain was the first to show up. They came for gold and silver and also to convert the natives. And they were very successful in both of those. They were able to become a global superpower, and most of the Latin American population, even today, is still Christian, thanks to Spanish missionaries. Colonial rule, it was direct. Colonists were subjects under the Spanish king. Um, the economy in New Spain was based off of the extraction of crops and mining and the encomienda plantation system. Relations with the natives, the Spanish mostly ruled over them and enslaved them, but there was still a good amount of intermarriage, and the babies from these mixed couples created a very complex, confusing social hierarchy in New Spain. For the French, they came to the New World also to convert the natives, but to a lesser degree than the Spanish. They mostly came for trade, specifically the fur trade, and that was the basis of their colonial economy. They also did it out of rivalry. At the time, Europe was divided into rival states, and if Spain had colonies in the New World, they had to compete with them, so they made colonies too. Their relations with the natives were different. They were highly cooperative with them, and there was a good degree of intermarriage among them. The English were the last to arrive on the scene because of their Reformation and Civil War, but they also came out of rivalry. They also brought more settlers than the Spanish and French did, and they came mostly for economic and religious freedom. Colonial rule in the British colonies were mostly centered in their colonial assemblies, so it was more self-ruled than a direct rule. Um, their economy was based off of tobacco and cash crops and food crops. Relations with the natives, it wasn't like Thanksgiving all the time. There was limited cooperation with them and a good amount of violence. Let's move on to the Columbian Exchange, also called the Great Biological Exchange. Lots of stuff coming from Europe to the New World and vice versa. So let's start from the Old World to the New World. The Europeans brought a great amount of disease that killed off a whole lot of the native population. They also brought horses and domesticated animals. Horses would become an integral part of North American Indian society. They brought domesticated plants like sugar and tobacco, and people, of course, both European and African slaves. All right, so from the New World to the Old World, tobacco was a major export of the New World colonies. Europeans couldn't grow tobacco in Europe, but smoking was very popular, so they used their colonies to get tobacco. Also, food. Some New World food revolutionized the European diets. This food included corn, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, cocoa, and more. Fur was also a major export from the New World to the Old World, especially from New France. Fur hats were very popular in that time. And also, animals and plants from the New World found their way to Europe. But let's focus on the English colonies, seeing that they become the United States. And in the beginning, they can be split up into the Chesapeake and New England colonies. And they're both very unique. The Chesapeake colonies, they were made for mostly profit. They were actually owned by companies rather than the crown at first. Their economy was based almost solely on tobacco farming, which is why they mostly settled along water, as you can see in that map. For politics, they were organized in colonial assemblies, like I mentioned earlier, and the House of Burgesses was in Virginia. That was just one of the assemblies. Most of the settlers were Anglican and Catholic, which were popular in England as well. Social classes were simple. There was the planters, who were the owners of the plantations, white indentured servants, and African slaves too. And there weren't too many women in the Chesapeake, so there wasn't enough. There weren't enough women for a firm patriarchy to form. In New England, it was a lot different. The motive there was to form a theocracy and to seek religious freedom. That's actually how the New England colonies got their shapes, as you can see. Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, they were all slightly different forms of a persecuted religion, especially Puritanism. So the Puritans, their economy was based off of food crops, shipbuilding, fishing. The politics, like I said, the church mostly called the shots. Social classes were even simpler in New England than they were in the Chesapeake. It was mostly broken up into those who attended church and those who weren't religious. And there were a whole lot more women in New England than they were in the Chesapeake. So a patriarchy similar to that found in England was formed in New England. So the rest of the 13 colonies were filled up after that. North and South Carolina formed with violent Native American problems. We bought New York from the Dutch, and New Jersey branched off from that. William Penn and the Quakers found Pennsylvania and Delaware, and Georgia was finally the last colony, formed in 1754, and it was a large commercial success. So as we got well into the 1700s, instead of breaking up the British colonies into the Chesapeake and New England colonies, we can break them up easily into the Southern and New England colonies. And the differences are pretty similar, if that makes sense at all. So the Southern colonies, their economy was based off of cash crop plantations. There was plentiful land, and on that land, indentured servants worked, but mostly a growing African slave population. And most of the English there were Anglican. In New England, instead of living on plantations, people mostly lived in townships and close-knit villages. There were some small farms, but the economy was mostly run by fishing and shipbuilding. Triangle trade became very popular. New England was a trading hub. You should be pretty familiar with the triangle trade between Europe, North America, and Africa, as shown in this picture, which you can hopefully read. And all of this growth put strains on Puritan influence, and that only strained further with the Great Awakening. So in Europe at the time, the Enlightenment was going on, and it stressed reason, rationalism, and logic over the old religions. So itinerant preachers like Jonathan Edwards here on the left and George Whitefield on the right led these really strange religious revivals that were really emotional and criticized the old religions, and they stressed avoiding or even killing the devil, and people were put into these trance-like states, and it was really quite bizarre. But as a result of it, these new religions like the Baptists formed, and they were called New Light religions, as opposed to the old Light religions like the Anglicans and the Puritans. And so yeah, the separation of religions. Let's move on to English administration, sort of switching gears. But I mentioned earlier the colonies in Britain were mostly self-ruled, but of course there has to be some degree of administration from the homeland, and it was influenced by the mercantile system, which was popular in Europe at the time. And what it said mostly was that there's a fixed amount of resources in the world, and a nation only gains wealth at the expense of another nation. So the government should control the economy and monopolize industries so they can get all those resources and wealth. And Oliver Cromwell, looking at this system, um, made the Navigation Acts, and the Navigation Acts forced the colonies to give their raw goods to Britain and to buy their finished goods from Britain. There was no manufacturing allowed in the colonies. They couldn't sell or buy from any other countries. And this sounds very strict, but it really wasn't enforced at the beginning. Um, but it started getting enforced after the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War started from the Seven Years' War, which started in Europe between England and France and sort of spilled over to the colonies. Young British general by the name of George Washington, right there on the right, um, uh, fought for the British in this war, and he helped destroy France, destroy New France and their Indian allies. But in that victory, the British racked up a whole lot of war debts that they had to pay off. So going into the 1760s, we see conflicting goals among the British and Americans. The British wanted to make peace with the Indians in the Ohio Valley. They also wanted to enforce the Navigation Acts and increase taxes on the colonies so they could pay off those war debts. But the Americans wanted to expand into the Ohio Valley, and they wanted to maintain the loose restrictions on trade and maintain their colonial assemblies and self-rule. So this all leads up to the events leading up to the American Revolution. So in 1763, George Grenville, who's on the left there, becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he does a whole lot of unpopular stuff. First, he passes the Proclamation Line of 1763 here in the middle, and it makes it illegal for colonists to expand west beyond that line into Indian territory. He also passes the Currency Act, the Quartering Act. He strictly enforces the Navigation Acts, passes the Sugar Act and Stamp Act as well. All of it not too successful and extremely unpopular. The colonial response was a lot of protests, boycotts of British goods. The saying "no taxation without representation" became popular. This guy, Sam Adams, formed the Sons of Liberty, who led all of this unrest and protest. So George Grenville is going to step down from the position of Prime Minister, and Charles Townshend here takes over, and he passes the unpopular Townshend Acts. Colonial resentment only grew. There were even more boycotts and protests. The Boston Massacre in 1770. Only 5 people were killed, but it was a huge deal. Paul Revere made this sketch. It was probably kind of exaggerated. It probably wasn't as brutal as this makes it appear. But the colonial population was furious with Great Britain after the massacre. And Great Britain only piled it on with the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts, also called the Intolerable Acts. The boycotts and protests continued. Committees of correspondence were formed in the colonies, and they basically coordinated them and made them more unified than they were before. The Boston Tea Party was led by the Sons of Liberty to combat the Tea Act. And the First Continental Congress convened in 1774, and that really brought all of the colonies together. Finally, in April of 1775, the first shots were fired in the Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord. In May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. And they appointed George Washington as general of the Continental Army. Some more battles broke out. The first major battle of the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Bunker Hill, shown in the bottom left here. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense came out, said these are the times to try men's souls. It was extraordinarily popular in the colonies and influenced the Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th of 1776. And hooray, the United States was its own country, according to them at least. But they had a large war on their hands with a global superpower in Great Britain. But we're going to see how that all unfolds in the next video and Unit 2. Thank you for watching this. I hope you got something out of it. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.